Dismiss. Huzzah.
Huzzah.
Ah!
By the year 1780, the American Revolution had been going on for 5 years, and it wasn't going well for either side. The British could not understand what was taking so long to put down this rebellion. After all, they had the most powerful army in the world, the largest and most powerful navy in the world. They're fighting rebels, poorly trained Continentals, untrained militia, farmers, merchants, and backwoodsmen. General Washington, the American commander, was in Camden, Morristown, New Jersey. He had just gone through a terrible winter, much worse than the one at Valley Forge a few years before. The snow was already 6 feet deep on the ground when his men began to build their winter quarters. They didn't have proper clothing, they had very little food or medicine, and they were without pay. Desertion was high. Washington beseeched Congress over and over to send aid, anything they could send. The Congress had nothing to send. He wrote them saying the only thing holding this army together is its sense of patriotism, and we cannot depend on that cement to last forever. On the other hand, the British commander in America, Sir Henry Clinton, he occupied New York City. He was living in a comfortable home. He had plenty of good food, good wine. There were parties at night. So he was in no hurry to go out and chase Washington around the countryside. So the war was at a stalemate. Back in England, the government there was going broke fighting this war, which for them had now become a world war. Not only were they fighting us here in the colonies, they were also fighting the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch. Parliament wanted the war to end. The British people, also suffering shortages, were rioting in the streets. They too wanted the war to end. But King George was very fond of his American colonies and did not want to give them up. So the British came up with a new plan. They called it the Southern Strategy. They believed the colonies in the South, mainly the Carolinas, were more loyal to the Crown than the ones up north where the rebellion had begun. And if they could invade the South in force, they were certain the people there would flock to join the king's forces, thereby splitting the colonies in two. And they realized this would be their last chance to end the rebellion in their favor. So, in the winter of 1780, Sir Henry Clinton sailed from New York with over 100 ships and just under 9,000 soldiers. His destination was Charleston, South Carolina, the largest, the wealthiest city in the South. His fleet encountered foul weather. Some ships were blown off course, and a few others sank, taking with them a lot of his supplies and all of his horses. But he managed to land south of Charleston in March. He disembarked, gathered more supplies, rounded up more horses, and advanced northward to completely surround and lay siege to the city of Charleston. The city was defended by 5,500 Continentals under the command of General Benjamin Lincoln. He was a good commander, did the best he could, but he was vastly outnumbered, completely surrounded without any avenue of escape. And when the British began to shell the city with their cannon, he was compelled to surrender at discretion. And with him, the entire Southern American Army, all the men, the weapons, the supplies, cannon, everything was now in British hands. It was the largest single defeat America suffered in the entire war. Clinton, convinced the Southern strategy was going to work, he sailed back to New York, leaving in command Major General Charles Cornwallis. Cornwallis was to continue to put down any remaining rebellion found in South Carolina, advance northward through the same, North Carolina, and then Virginia, Pennsylvania, and eventually get behind Washington in New Jersey, where Clinton would come out of New York, where they would completely surround him and force him to surrender, thus ending the rebellion. That was their plan. Cornwallis advanced to Camden, South Carolina, with the main part of his army. On his right flank, defending his supply lines along the coast, was Lieutenant Colonel Banister Tarleton and his mounted dragoons. Now Tarleton, he was a young man. He was 26 years of age, but he despised anyone who was not loyal to his king. And if he came upon a home owned by rebels, he would take everything they had, their food, their clothing, their livestock, and then burn the house to the ground, leaving them with just the clothes on their backs. If he came upon any rebel militia, he would give them no quarter, even going so far as to bayonet wounded men lying on the ground, as he did to Colonel Buford's command at the Waxhaws just after the fall of Charleston. He was much hated in the area and earned the nickname of Bloody Band. On Cornwallis's left flank was Major Patrick Ferguson. Now Ferguson was a different kind of man. He despised Tarleton for his tactics. In fact, the two men despised each other. Ferguson believed that these people in the Carolinas, they were still British subjects and could easily be persuaded to join the king's forces. After all, the British occupied the countryside. It was obvious England was going to win the war. So why not join now? Protect your homes, your families, and even your own lives. And he was good at it. He raised over 4,000 Tory militia. He was able to put 1,000 of them in the field, well trained in the British coat of arms. He was also there to guard Cornwallis's western flank against these roaming bands of partisan militia that were still attacking the British at will and slowing down Cornwallis's advance northward. Those militias under Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, Thomas Sumter, the Gamecock, and Elijah Clark. And Clark was somebody Ferguson really wanted to get his hands on, and he had his men scouring the countryside looking for him. Congress, in haste, put together another army to try to stop Cornwallis. It was comprised of 3,000 men, 2/3 of which were completely untrained militia, The other third were Continentals, under the command of a very competent Bavarian general, Johann de Kalb. They put in command of this army, against the advice of George Washington, the hero of Saratoga, General Horatio Gates. When Gates joined his army, who he proudly dubbed the Grand Army, against the advice of his officers, he immediately sent them on a forced march southward to confront Cornwallis. The militia were completely untrained in any military drill. They had very few supplies, and it was the intense heat of mid-August. Regardless, he marched them on. The men grew sick and tired from the weather and the poor diet. They had some stringy beef along and picked corn and peaches from passing fields and orchards. But as the days grew on, they were more and more tired and more sick. But he drove them on. In the pre-dawn darkness of August 16th, two armies bumped into each other just north of Camden. They exchanged a few shots. Both sides retired to form battle lines the next morning. And now Gates, proving the complete ignorance of the men he commanded, placed his most inexperienced militia directly opposite Cornwallis's crack troops, the 21st Regiment of Foot and the Highland Fusiliers. The battle began. The British charged. The militia broke and ran, many dropping their loaded muskets on the ground. Kalb and his Continentals put up a good fight, even going so far as to mount a countercharge at one point. But he was soon quickly surrounded, and when he fell, he had 11 wounds on his body, including a saber slash right across the top of his head. He would not retreat until he had orders from his general to do so. But his general wasn't there. When Gates saw his army disintegrate before his eyes, he spurred his horse and didn't stop running for 3.5 days until he was 200 miles away in Hillsborough, North Carolina, in total disgrace. Another American army had been completely decimated. When Washington heard of Camden, he stated, "Our cause now stands at the edge of a precipice." But now there was no one left to stop Cornwallis. It looked like the Southern campaign would prevail. But then, 2 days after Camden, at a place called Musgroves Mill, a group of howling, screaming backwoodsmen came pouring out of the forest, attacked Patrick Ferguson's camp. They inflicted over 200 casualties before they melted back into the woods and over the Blue Ridge Mountains out of reach. Well, Ferguson had had enough. He was tired of these partisan bands with their hit-and-run tactics, and he was going to put a stop to it. So he paroled a prisoner captured at Musgroves Mill. A young man, the name of Samuel Phillips, happened to be a cousin of Isaac Shelby, Colonel Isaac Shelby, one of the American commanders who attacked his camp. He sent young Samuel over the mountains to find this Colonel Shelby and deliver a message. And that message was, if you do not desist in your opposition to the British arms and come under the protection of my standard, I will march my army over the mountains, hang your leaders, and lay waste your country with fire and sword. Well, that message did not have its desired effect. Isaac Shelby, not the kind of man to hide and cower under such a threat. He immediately mounted his horse and rode 40 miles to confer with his good friend, Colonel John Sevier, in the Nowachucky settlements. Now, Sevier was at the end of a 2-week wedding celebration when Shelby rode up, but he broke off immediately, and the two men sat down to discuss what to do about this arrogant Scotsman who dared threaten to burn their homes and hang them. They were not about to sit around and wait for that to happen. Now, they each had about 240 men and their respective militias, and they knew that was not enough to defeat Ferguson's force. So they sent word to Colonel William Campbell in Virginia, who had a much larger force under him. At first, Campbell refused to send aid, thinking it prudent to keep his army together in case of an attack on the lead and salt mines he was guarding in his area. But Shelby wrote him again, telling him, if Ferguson does indeed come over the mountains, we're not strong enough to stop him. And when he defeats us, he'll turn on you, and we'll be unable to lend you aid. So Campbell relented. He agreed to send 200 of his militia to join the expedition. Call to arms went out. The militias began to gather at their mustering grounds. They all agreed to meet on September 25th at the Sycamore Shoals on the Watauga River. Early that afternoon, 200 Virginians thundered across the Watauga River to join the militias already encamped there, those of Shelby, Sevier, and 160 men under Colonel Charles McDowell. Later that afternoon, that scene was repeated as an additional 200 Virginians crossed that river, led there by Colonel Arthur Campbell, William Campbell's cousin. He then returned home to organize a defense against any possible British or Indian attack. There was much rejoicing at the unexpected arrival of this second group, for now our numbers swelled to over 1,000 men, and now we knew we had enough. My name is Major Patrick Wilson. I served under Isaac Shelby in the Kings Mountain campaign. That night, as I looked out over that broad open field on the banks of the Watauga, I saw over 1,000 campfires flickering in the darkness. It was the largest assembly of humanity I had ever seen in my life. As I walked among the camps, seeing old friends and making new ones, the one thing I did not see was a single soldier. There was not a uniform, military musket, or bayonet to be seen anywhere. Every one of us was a volunteer. We had on our own clothes, we brought along our own equipment, and we carried our own hunting rifles. But the one thing I did see on every face that night lit by the firelight was determination. We all knew why we came, why we gathered there. And we all knew what we had to do. I don't believe any of us got much sleep that night. The next morning, as we prepared to leave, a man stepped forward, a young man well known in the area, Presbyterian minister, the name of Rev Samuel Doke. He stepped up to give us all a sermon and a prayer. Reverend Doke.
The Major said, I am Samuel Doke. When these men and their families crossed over the mountains and established those settlements, I traveled over the mountains with them to minister to them and their families. And so when this threat came over the mountains and these men traveled over the mountains to meet that threat, I felt the need to travel with them. And so as I walked through those camps and saw those fires that night, it rested very heavy on my heart, and I went back to my tent and I prayed late into the night, and I put pen to paper and wrote this. My countrymen, you're about to set out on an expedition which is full of hardships and dangers, but one in which the Almighty will attend you. The mother country has her hands upon you, these American colonies, and takes that which our fathers planted their homes in the wilderness, your liberty. Taxation without representation, and the quartering of soldiers in the houses of our people without their consent is evidence that the crown would take from its American subjects the last vestige of freedom. Your brethren across the mountain cry out like Macedonia unto your help. God forbid that you should refuse to hear and answer their call. But their call is not all. For the enemy is marching hither to your own homes. Brave men, you are not unaccustomed to battle. Your hands have been taught to war, and your fingers to fight. You have wrested these beautiful valleys of the Holston and Watauga from the savage hand. Will you tarry now until the other enemy carries fire and sword to your very doors?
No!
No, it shall not be. Go forth in the strength of your manhood to the aid of your brethren and the defense of your liberty and the protection of your homes. And may the God of justice be with you and give you victory.
Victory!
Let us pray. Almighty and gracious God, thou hast been the refuge and strength of thy people in all ages. In time of sorest need, we have learned to come to you, our rock and our fortress. Thou knowest the dangers and snares that surround us on march and in battle. Thou knowest the dangers that constantly threaten the humble but well-beloved homes which thy servants have left behind them. Oh, in thine infinite mercy, save us from the cruel hand of the savage and of tyrant. Save the unprotected homes while fathers and husbands and sons are far away, fighting for freedom and helping the oppressed. Thou who promised to protect the sparrow in its flight, keep ceaseless watch by day and by night over our loved ones, the helpless women and the little children. We commit to thy care. Thou wilt not leave them or forsake them in times of loneliness and anxiety and terror. O God of battle, arise in thy might. Avenge the slaughter of thy people. Confound those who plot for our destruction. Crown this mighty effort with victory and smite those who exalt themselves against liberty and justice and truth. Help us as good soldiers to wield the sword of the Lord at Gideon. Amen.
Well, with that, we all shouted, "Sword of the Lord and of Gideon," as we mounted our horses. Those of us who had families there said their goodbyes, maybe for the last time. And then we rode out in search of Patrick Ferguson. We covered about 20 miles that first day. We had with us a small herd of cattle we had brought along for food. But they were proving impossible to keep pointed in the same direction on these narrow mountain trails we had to cross. So we stopped at a spot called the Resting Place. It was a broad open field by a small creek with a large rock overhang called the Shelving Rock. And there it began to rain. Now, we had with us 500 pounds of very high quality, fast burning gunpowder made for us by Mary Patton at her powder mill on Buffalo Creek in the Watauga settlement. And we could not afford to have any of that powder get wet. If it did, we'd just have to turn around and go back. So we placed the powder under the Shelving Rock with a heavy guard, and we slept out in the field with our blankets in the rain as best we could. The next morning, we woke up, we decided we couldn't take these cattle with us any further. They were slowing us down too much. So we butchered a few, packed the meat on horses, sent the rest back to Watauga. And we headed out on Bright Straits through the Yellow Mountain Gap over the Blue Ridge Mountains. The higher we climbed, the colder it got. And that rain below had now turned to snow. Now some of the men had boots. Most had shoes or moccasins. But there were some that were barefoot. Regardless, we stopped on top of the bald to break for a midday meal, do a little drilling, and take a roll call. It was then we discovered that two of John Severe's men, were missing. The names of Chambers and Crawford. Now, some of us believed they might have Tory leanings. Others thought they were downright spies. And now we feared they had gone ahead to warn Ferguson of this Overmountain army heading his way. So we could tarry on that mountaintop no longer. We broke camp, continued on Bright Straits for another 2 days, till we came to where the trail forked off. Now we all planned on taking one trail down out of the mountains into the Carolina Piedmont, but now we feared if Ferguson was alerted of our coming, he just might be marching up the other trail. He could get behind us, attack our homes and our families in our absence. So we decided to split our forces. The trails being only about 5 miles apart, we knew if one side was attacked, the other could quickly lend aid. So Colonel Campbell and his men descended down into Turkey Cove, and Colonel Sevier and Shelby descended down through North Cove. We all agreed to meet up again in 2 days at the Quaker Meadows, the plantation of Charles McDowell.
My name is Thomas Morgan. I had took my family over the mountains back in '73, and like every other man that crossed those mountains, I had joined the militia. I served under Colonel John Sevier, Nolichucky Jack's what we called him, and I had rode on many, many campaigns with that man against the Cherokee over the years. But I got to tell you, this was unlike anything we'd ever experienced, because every man that was with us that day knew that we was riding against the most powerful army of the whole world. We knew our chances were slim. We come riding into the Quaker Meadows that evening in the rain, and the McDowells, they were so gracious to us. They let us take the top rail off their fence and burn it for wood to try to dry out. Let us pull a little corn, brought in a little beef, try to feed us the best they could. And as we sat on that wet ground in the rain that evening, well, here come a whole group of men riding in from Surrey County, North Carolina. They was being led by Major Winston and a great big old man named Benjamin Cleveland. Now, I'd heard of Colonel Ben Cleveland. He was notorious for hanging loyalists. If you was loyal to King George and you run into Ben Cleveland, the last sound you hear would be your neck snap at the end of a rope, because he'd hang you. I really liked that old man. And our army was growing. And as we laid there in the pouring rain that night in our blankets, some scouts came in. They'd located Ferguson. He was camped a few days' ride from us at a place called Gilberttown. We got up the next morning in the rain and took to the saddle, went thundering across the Catawba River. We was headed straight for him like a lightning bolt. We're going to put an end to this threat. We got a couple of days' ride outside of Gilberttown, and the sky opened up on us. It began to pour down the rain. So we all hunkered down under a group of cedar trees, trying to stay as dry as we could, keep our powder dry, praying that the rain would stop, but it didn't. So we decided to push on. We got right outside of Gilberttown. We tied our horses up into the tree lines, took our rifles, and we moved in on foot. We went screaming out in that field where old Ferguson was at, and he was gone. There was nothing there but cold campfires. He'd been gone for 2 days. And even the best of us scouts could not find his trail. It had rained so much the ground was like a swamp. One of the commanders that was traveling with us, Williams was his name, he said, Ferguson, he's probably riding that big old British fort down South Line at Fort 96. So we cut and we started riding in that direction because we had to catch him. The next night we was camped down on the Green River, a place called Alexander's Ford. In the middle of the night, I never heard such a commotion. A man come riding through the camps. Some of the boys about shot him out of the saddle. They grabbed him, wrestled him to the ground, and we was going to hang him. Thought for sure we had us a spy or a scout. He said, "My name's Colonel Edward Lacey. Take me up to see one of the commanders." So we drug him up to see Colonel Sevier, and sure enough, that's who it was. Now, Colonel Lacey, he asked the colonel, "So where you boys headed?" Colonel Sevier said, "We're riding toward Fort 96. We've got to catch Patrick Ferguson." He said, "I don't know where you got your intelligence, but you're riding the wrong way. Ferguson's not headed to Fort 96. He's headed toward Charlottetown to get reinforcements from Cornwallis." Now, we all knew, every one of us knew, that if Ferguson got reinforcements from Cornwallis, especially if he got your dragoons under Tarleton, none of us would ever cross those mountains again. We had rode straight to our deaths. Now, Lacey, he had a whole group of men camped just a few miles from us, a group of little patriot fighters, and he agreed to meet us the next day at a place called the Cow Pens. We got up that morning in the pouring rain, and we rode 29 miles that day. We come riding into the Cow Pens, and Lacey was already there with his men. Now, the Cow Pens, it was owned by a wealthy loyalist. He'd buy up all the cattle in that area and graze them on that good grass and to drive them north to Philadelphia and sell them. We come riding in there, and honestly, we hadn't had a bite to eat since we left Quaker Meadows. And I can honestly say that all the men that I was riding with that I knew, none of us were a thief. But I remember one time the Reverend Doke said the Lord helps those that help themselves. That's what we did. We helped ourselves to that man's beef. We didn't think he'd care a whole lot because we were starved to death, and every one of us had a rifle. That was the best meal we'd had in a long time. As we sat there that evening in the rain trying to rest, nobody could rest because we knew this was our only chance. We would never, ever have an army like this together again. Sat there in the pouring rain that evening. The commanders had called a meeting and made a decision. They come walking through our camps that afternoon, and they started picking out 900 of the best men. They picked out 900 of the best horses that we hadn't rode almost to death chasing Ferguson. And I'll never forget it, at 9 o'clock at night, we took to the saddle and rode off in the dark in the pouring rain looking for Ferguson. All night long we rode through the darkness. Couldn't even see the horse in front of you. All you could hear was the hoof in the mud as they were running, as we were moving. It was raining so hard, so dark. We got to the Broad River down at the Cherokee Ford, and the river was completely flooded. We put our strongest horses downstream in case any of the men washed out of the saddle. There was nothing going to stop us. The next morning, we rode up on a little homestead, a little house. Had a young man traveling with us. Enoch was his name, Enoch Gilmer. Little Enoch come up to the commanders. He said, "Hey, I got an idea. If you let me ride over to that house, I'll find out where old Ferguson's at." So we all laid back in the woods. Little Enoch rode across the fields to the house, tied his horse up, walked up on the porch and knocked on the door, and there were two women living there. One of them opened the door. Little Enoch looked as tough as he could. He said, "I'm looking for Patrick Ferguson. I want to join his army." Well, he said, "Well, I know exactly where he's at because we took him eggs this morning. He's on Kings Mountain." Now, we give Enoch just about enough time. We figured he found out what we needed. Some of the boys went busting into that house and grabbed little Enoch, going to hang him as a traitor. And then women commenced to squall, "Well, don't hang him. He's just a boy." One of the men spoke up and said, "Well, let's don't offend these lovely ladies. Let's take him down the road and hang him." So they drug little Enoch out of the house where the women couldn't see him no more. The commanders called him up and said, "Enoch, did you find Ferguson?" He said, "Yeah, he's on Kings Mountain." So now we knew exactly where he was at. And we was riding harder than we'd ever ridden before because this threat was going to end, and it was going to end today. About lunch, a lot of the men were getting tired. They wanted to stop, take a rest. And old Isaac Shelby come riding right through the middle of all of us. He said, "Rest? I will not rest until I ride straight through the lines of Cornwallis himself." He fired us up and we kept riding. Now, right before 3 o'clock, by the grace of God, finally the rain had stopped. And we were at the bottom of Kings Mountain. You know, Colonel Campbell, they had voted him the overall commander. He told us all, each and every one of us, he said, "Scream like hell and fight like the devil." Colonel Shelby told us all, he said, "Don't wait for orders. Every man's his own captain." He said, "Every man's his own captain. Don't wait for orders. Give them Indian plate." We hit that mountain the first time. Them boys from Virginia under Colonel Campbell, they took the front of that little old mountain. Isaac Shelby and the boys from the Holston settlement, they went around one side. Williams, Lacey, Cleveland, other commanders took the back. Colonel Sevier took us boys from the Watauga, and we were around this side of the mountain. We had him. He wasn't going anywhere. We hit the mountain the first time, and they drove us completely back. We regrouped, hit that mountain the second time, went a little further that time, but once again, they had pushed us back. But the third time, The third time we hit that little mountain, we went almost to the top. We was so close on them that a lot of the boys were fighting with their knives and their tomahawks against their bayonets. We hit that mountain the third time. You know, a lot of us older men, we remember when we went across the mountain and settled, when we was having trouble with the Cherokee. When they had attacked the settlements, why, they'd come screaming out of them woods. It would make your hair stand up. It would make your skin crawl. So as we hit that mountain the third time, we were screaming our heads off just like the Cherokee. But not only were we screaming like the Cherokee, we were fighting like the Cherokee because we had learned very well. We was giving them Indian play. We was hiding behind the trees and rocks, would step out and fire and step right back in and reload. And like I said, we went almost to the top. And sure enough, there was Ferguson. He was riding back and forward on the crest of that little mountain. He had his saber in one hand, 2 silver whistles, and he was riding back and forth, blowing those whistles and barking out commands to his men. You know, a lot of his men seen that we was overrunning because we was swarming like yellow jackets. They'd raise up a white flag and Ferguson come riding by and just cut it down. Now, to this day, I cannot tell you if Ferguson was trying to escape. I can't tell you if he was trying to rally his men. But what I can tell you for a fact is he got too far on the south side of the mountain that day. And he ran smack into John Sevier and us boys from the Watauga. I was standing behind a big white oak tree. I'd stick my head around to shoot the bark and fly off. The air was completely full of lead. The gun smoke was so thick it looked like a fog on top of the mountain that day. We couldn't even really see our targets, but we never let up shooting. There was a young man right over from me, John Gilliland was his name. I heard young John say, "Hey, here comes Ferguson." He raised that rifle. He took a real careful aim. And when he touched the trigger, it would click. It misfired. But there was an older gentleman right over from him that day. He was something else. Everybody in the settlement pretty much knew him. Robert Young was his name. Robert was 62 years old. Now, for you folks that don't know, Robert had named his rifle after his wife Mary. But he didn't call his rifle Mary. He called it Sweet Lips because that's what he called Mary. I seen old Robert. He raised that rifle up. He took a real careful aim. I heard him say, "We'll see what Sweet Lips can do." And when he touched that trigger, Ferguson came right out of the saddle. But you know, his horse spooked. His foot was hung in the stirrup. You know, by the time the boys got his horse stopped, he had 8 more holes drilled through him. Ferguson told his men when he got to King's Mountain, he said, "God Almighty and all his angels won't take me off the mountain." Didn't realize how right he was, but that's where we left him. Every man that was fighting with Ferguson that day was killed or captured. And they was 28 patriots who never seen the sunset. We camped at the bottom of that little old mountain that night. And I got to tell you, to this day, I can still hear the sounds of the wounded and the dying. Started marching the prisoners north over the Yadkin River. A few days later, we sent some boys marching them on. The rest of us cut and headed back toward the mountain. You know, it took about a week for old Cornwallis to find out we'd whipped Ferguson so bad. But when he found out, well, what I hear, he turned tail around like a scalded dog. He started retreating. Had no idea where this band of rabble went, this Overmountain army. As a matter of fact, the last I heard of Cornwallis, old Dan Morgan and Nathaniel Green was running him ragged all over the mountains, and he was headed back toward Virginia. But us Overmountain men, we went right back across the mountain. We went back over to raise our crops and to raise our family. But the most important seed that we had ever planted was that day on this little mountain. Because within an hour and 5 minutes, we had planted a seed of freedom. Because what we did that day, if you think about it, it was nothing short of a miracle. Because there was a band of 900 starved, exhausted. Hunters and farmers volunteered to the very last man. We stopped and we forced the retreat of the most powerful army in the whole world. Then we went home.
Well, the story of Kings Mountain does not end that day. The Battle of Kings Mountain did, but the story continues on. It's been said many times over the years, the Battle of Kings Mountain is the turning and was the turning point of the Southern strategy in the Southern colonies of the Revolutionary War. Hit Cornwallis so hard that he had to rethink his strategy and figure out what to do next, because he has lost 1/3 of his command in the Southern colonies. January 17, 1781, Battle of Cowpens. Patriot win, Patriot victory. Tarleton himself almost lost his life that day, and he had to flee in order to save his own hide. March 15th that year, a battle at Guilford Courthouse. Now, it was a Patriot defeat, but the British lost so many forces that day, so many men that day, one should say that the British actually lost the battle. They lost over 25% of his men, Cornwallis did. So Cornwallis had to do a lot of rethinking, and he finally decided the best thing for him to do is head back toward Virginia now. I'm not getting anywhere now. So he starts toward Virginia 12 months, 12 days after the Battle of Kings Mountain. Cornwallis himself finds that he and his military force is completely surrounded at a place called Yorktown, Virginia. Realizing that, he surrendered his force to General George Washington. But that still doesn't end the story of Kings Mountain. Although it's almost over, more or less the Revolutionary War has come to an end, there are still a few more battles. September 1783 in Paris, France. The British officials and the officials from the colonies got together and signed what we know today as the Treaty of Paris. Now, Kings Mountain story has ended. Now, the Revolutionary War has officially ended. And we start a new story. Brand new story started that day. This is a story that every one of you out there is part of. Every one of us is part of. We're making the history today. And we know this story today as the United States of America. Huzzah! Right quickly, I want to tell you a little bit about our group. We're the Overmountain Victory Trail Association. We were formed as an organization in 1979. The first commemorative march happened about 1975. The previous year, 1974, two men over in Boone, North Carolina. Both of them historians. One was a writer. The other one was the director of the consortium up there. Did a lot of Appalachian history. They said, you know, there's one story we hadn't told yet, and that's the Battle of Kings Mountain. So those two men got together, started studying the trail. How can we do this? And they involved a tremendous number of people. So September the 25th, 1975, the very first commemorative march for the Overmountain Victory Trail started. This year marks the 46th march. We were not about to let that die this year, and so we put all this together and continued on the march, following the same days those men did on the original march. We've got a fine group of folks that's been with us. But those men and ladies, I should say, they did not stop there. They kept working on Senator Broy Hill here in North Carolina until 1980, just before the march started in September. They managed to get President Carter, to sign the bill that makes this a National Historic Trail. Prior to that, all the trails was just recreation. And now we had some historic trails on the ground. So when you walk out here on this trail, you're actually in the national parks, because the National Parks Service is over them. And we partner with the national parks so that we can do this program each year and tell you about this story of Kings Mountain. That's a little history of our organization. We do accept memberships as well too. But what I like to do at this particular time, Steve, I probably ought to do the volley first, shouldn't we? So, drummer, call for fall in. Drummer has fallen out. That's what happens when you get youth in pipe and drums. They get kind of sleepy. Go up there and